My name is Dr. David Renné. I'm president of the International Solar Energy Society, and I'm here at the Masdar Institute to give a seminar on the future of solar. What I'm going to talk about today, I have this presentation in two parts. First, as I'm doing right now, I'll give an outline of the seminar, give a brief overview of the technologies. I'm sure many of you probably know a lot more about all these things than I do. And by the way, I also would like to encourage you to feel free to ask questions anytime, or if I'm going too fast or not saying things quite right, please feel free to ask a question or slow me down. Talk briefly about renewable energy potentials. And of course, the climate challenge is very much a part of all of these technologies these days. And then I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what is making renewable energy successful, and as a result of those success stories, what is the current status and the future trends of renewable energy, with a particular emphasis on solar. And then after the break, I'm going to get into more detail about some of the technical issues associated especially with deploying large amounts of photovoltaics, especially into the grid system. And I'll go into some detail about some of the meteorological aspects of grid integration. And so it's the work that I was focusing on quite a bit my last few years at NRO. And then I'll have a brief presentation about ISIS and hopefully get all of you to join that organization. Okay, this is just a very simple slide depicting the various types of solar energy collector types. So what I'm going to do first of all is just go through a brief summary of the technologies, and mostly on solar. As you know, the sun can be utilized in a variety of different ways to support various technologies. Photovoltaics, which is what will be the major source of, or major point of my talk today. Solar heating for buildings, solar electricity derived from concentrating solar power systems. Of course, the sun is important for biomass generation, passive solar in buildings, and even technologies such as solar detoxification have been given quite a bit of research in the past. So under PV technologies, there's basically three categories of photovoltaics. There's concentrating photovoltaic, which is an emerging technology. It's been looked at for a number of years, and this is where the sun is concentrated onto a photoelectric diode cell to get a lot more energy out of that cell. There are now some commercial projects going on around the world in CPV. Thin film technology is a more recent technology compared to the crystalline silicon technologies. I should actually start over here. The crystalline silicon technologies are the real workhorse of the industry. And these are multi-crystalline or monocrystalline technologies. This is what you see many places all around the world. It's a relatively highly efficient and well-known technology, relatively low cost. But the thin film technologies offer the opportunity to reduce a lot of the manufacturing costs and create a material that's more flexible and more adaptable to many situations. The efficiencies of these technologies tend to be somewhat lower right now than the crystalline silicon technologies. And then, as I mentioned, the concentrating photovoltaics. Concentrating solar power, there's basically three types, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. The Dish Stirling project, this is a photograph from a large commercial project in Arizona at a town called Maricopa. So this is putting, there's about maybe 100 or so of these systems there, and I don't recall the exact output of each individual Dish Stirling engine, but it's probably in the 100 kilowatt range. And basically it concentrates heat onto a Dish Stirling engine here, and with about 100 of these units you can get multi-megawatt scale output. Another very common technology that's getting commercial application is the towers, where you have a field of mirrors all concentrating solar energy into the top of a tower, and then there's a fluid in there that is used to create steam to power a regular electrical generator. And this is a project in Spain, and there's some going up in the United States as well. And then the more The one that's been around the longest, the trough technologies, these have been around since the 1980s, and they're still probably the most advanced technologically and commercially of all three of these technologies. And I noticed that you have some troughs being tested here at the Masdar City sites. Solar heating and cooling is another important area. And I just wanted to highlight that I work on a IEA, International Energy Agency, solar heating and cooling program. And I cannot do justice to the full range of technologies during this talk, but I wanted to highlight that under that program, a Solar Heat Worldwide report is published annually. And I'll show some more statistics later that show just how much this technology is growing around the world. And this is primarily, traditionally it's been rooftop solar systems to produce hot water for domestic use. But these are being scaled up now so that there's commercial hot water systems, and there's also a lot of technology that's going on to provide solar cooling. And in fact, here's a project here in the United Arab Emirates by Solid, company in Germany, that is putting in a solar cooling project. It's at the Sheikh Zayed Desert Learning Center. I'm not sure exactly where that is. Is that near here, or is that, pardon me?
It's 2 hours away.
Okay. So I won't get into too many other technologies, just briefly talk about building technologies. These are slides that were provided by NREL. So various various concepts being tested, building integrated technologies and passive heating and cooling technologies within the buildings. It's a very big, very important area because buildings are roughly, represent roughly 1/3 of all the energy consumption around the world. Wind technologies, this is a slide again provided by NREL. There's a lot of research in particular taking place to improve the efficiency of wind turbines as they scale up in size. As you know now, some of these turbines are approaching 10 megawatts in size, especially the offshore systems. And so there's a lot of work being done when you scale up to a system that large to better understand the blades, the drive trains, and the tall tower components, looking at advanced drivetrain power conversion systems, superconducting direct drive generators, the flexible ultra-large rotors and systems are being researched. Control systems are very critical, especially for wind turbine systems, to improve their plant performance and especially to make them friendly to the grid, because these are variable energy technologies that really can have an impact on the grid, and I'll talk about that as a part of the second part of this presentation. So that's just a quick overview of some of that. And then another area that NREL is heavily involved in, so I'll just put this up just briefly to highlight this, and that is technologies, improved ways of cars performing with batteries, electric systems, and regenerative braking systems. That type of technology is being researched quite a bit. The electric infrastructure to charge the cars, and even some alternative fuel technologies are being studied as well. So that's a quick overview of technologies. My talk will focus on solar and in particular on PV, but just wanted to give a kind of a quick overview. And of course there are other technologies I didn't get into, like geothermal and hydropower technologies, all considered to be part of the renewable energy arena. Tidal technologies are becoming quite common, or not common deployment-wise, but they're becoming very, a lot of interest in using tidal energy for a renewable energy resource. And there are some commercial projects around the world. So now I'll go into a brief discussion about renewable energy potentials. And clearly, from a technological side, we are not limited by the amount of fuel that's available to power a renewable energy system. So we have substantial renewable energy resources available to us around the world. And clearly that's not a limiting factor. What makes it challenging is that they are distributed, they vary over space and they vary over time, of course, especially wind and solar. So even though the potential is high, there's still some significant challenges in accessing that resource and delivering power to meet a load in some location. But this is a slide that came out of the recent report by the IPCC called the Special Report on Renewable Energy Systems, or SRRN, I think is the acronym. And this is a best guess estimate of what the potential is for various technologies around the world. This is after removing issues like land use constraints or protected land areas or other physical constraints to the technology. A rough calculation was done for all these various technologies, and you can see that global electricity demand currently is somewhere right around here. But here you can see, for example, here's a potential estimate for geothermal energy. That technology by itself, the potential far exceeds the current electricity energy demand. It's hard to see where hydropower is because they can actually get that number down pretty specifically. It's very easy because of the nature of that technology to figure out what the global potential is, which is in the 50 to 52 gigawatt, let's see, this is hectajoule per year range. So hydropower is this line that you can hardly see that's right here. Again, comparable to the global demand. Ocean energy, our ability to estimate that is much more difficult right now. First of all, because the technologies are evolving, and also there just isn't a lot of data available on ocean, on the potential available in ocean energy. Wind energy estimates are, of course, quite high around the world. Well above the current demand, electricity demand. And then as you get over here to heating and cooling, based on geothermal, again, the global demand for heat is 164 hectajoules, is this line right here. And you can see that geothermal energy in and of itself could meet that demand. Of course, we also have solar heating and cooling, which wasn't shown on this particular chart, but is probably is captured more over here in the direct solar. This is this primary energy demand. This is where you use energy for whatever purpose, but it's not specifically related to electricity usage. And the global primary energy supply is up here, 492 hectajoules. And biomass is also a very large source of renewable energy today and represents a potentially significant component of that demand. So here's another way to look at it. And I'm going to have to click this multiple times, so I guess you're going to have to watch it over here on this screen. But there we go. So let's just look at it from a different perspective. And this is a slide put together by a colleague of mine, Dr. Richard Perez at SUNY Albany, and you'll see reference to him quite often throughout my talk because he's done a lot of work, groundbreaking work in solar resource assessment areas. But here's another way to look at the global demand. I gotta quit touching the screen. Roughly 16 terawatt years per year is our global energy use, primary energy use. And so if we're going to create a scaling of this usage by spheres. And so here we have the total reserves estimated from coal. So you can see we still have substantial coal resources available to us to meet our annual energy supply. That is uranium. So even for nuclear power, far more uranium resources than are currently needed for global energy supply. Petroleum is also quite large, but we're getting down to a little bit smaller. And that is, that's the north slope of Alaska. That's the reserves available in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. That's the perspective. Natural gas. By the way, this figure is a couple of years old, and it's possible that because of the discovery of new reserves over the past few years that these spheres could actually be larger now. But nevertheless, for our traditional energy resources, we still have significant reserves available to meet our annual energy needs. Now for wind, these numbers of course get to be much more difficult to pin down, but you can see wind alone could presumably meet all of our energy supply. There's, that is, what is that? Waves, I'm sorry, yeah, water waves. And there's ocean thermal energy. There's biomass energy. You can see now we're looking at resources that are comparable to what our demands are. Hydro, geothermal, and tides. And then here's the sun. So clearly this is a good way to make the case that solar energy is plentiful and is available to us. And the challenge is this: how do we access that resource and make good use of it in a cost-effective way? So what I'll do now is just talk briefly. Does anybody have any questions, by the way? If anybody has a question, please. Yes, you have a question.
Yeah, I'd like to know, how did you evaluate the potential for solar meeting primary energy demand? Consider what surface area?
Yeah, that's a good question. I remember going through the math. I don't have it at the top of my head, but basically you look at the solar. You know what the solar constant is at the top of the atmosphere, and you know how much energy is falling on a spherical surface. You can make that calculation. You remove the oceans because you presumably will not put technologies over the oceans, but everything else is included. All the land mass is included, and that's how they came up with that number. But you have to. There's a factor you use to estimate the resource falling on a spherical surface, because obviously it gets smaller and smaller as you get around to the edges of the sphere.
Perhaps it could be more realistic, to talk about the usable land.
Yeah.
Because of course you can't cover the whole.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a good point. I think that this is just intended to show the scale of the resources available, and I'll have another slide later in the second part that shows more specifically how we use geographic information systems to really narrow down what the potential is more specifically. Okay, let me just talk briefly about climate. I put this up here. I decided to add this into the talk because a lot of discussion in the United States, of course, and the Caribbean region about Hurricane Sandy that we experienced recently, and the amount of damage that hurricane did, and maybe it's important for governments, especially in developed countries, to pay more attention to what could potentially be causing unusual events like that. And Hurricane Sandy was a particularly unusual storm because it was not by any means an immense hurricane. It was a Category 1 hurricane, which is not an unusually large storm, of course. I think Katrina was Category 4. But what was unique about the Hurricane Sandy was, first of all, for whatever reason, it covered a much larger area than hurricanes normally did. So it created a lot of devastation in the Caribbean region, a lot of damage, far beyond what you would normally expect from a Category 1 hurricane. And then it moved up the Gulf Stream and re-energized, because the Gulf Stream is really unusually warm right now. It's at its highest temperature ever recorded, gathered a lot more energy. And then it happened to combine itself with a mid-latitude storm moving in from the northwest. And the combination of Sandy and that other storm merging together, and the position and the storm surge that was created from that, which was aggravated by unusually high tides, caused some of the worst damage, if not the worst damage, in terms of cost and also very important human lives throughout the Caribbean and in the United States, but especially in terms of cost and the disruption. And even now, there are still many, many people in the northeastern part of the United States without power and not even able to go back to their homes. So the point is that it's raised a lot of questions once again about, are we doing enough, or why aren't we doing more to mitigate climate change? Because even these storms that are, I wouldn't call them routine, but Category 1 type hurricanes can actually, for very unique reasons, can really cause a lot of damage. And I don't think there's, I don't want to get into a debate about whether climate change is occurring or not. I think there's, in my mind, there's the evidence is irrefutable that there is human-caused climate change that is occurring now. It's linked very tightly with the growth in carbon dioxide emissions that are also occurring due to human activities. As this warming occurs, it's going to get manifested in a variety of different ways in our climate, in our weather patterns. I think that's what we're going to see mostly, is that the extreme events will become more extreme, but perhaps even more frequent. So this is why the technologies that you're all working on are so important, because these will represent literally carbon-free technologies, and as they get deployed over large scales will hopefully start bringing our global emissions down. And these are just some examples from the IPCC reports. I won't go into any kind of detail, but you can see that virtually all different scenarios, regardless of what kind of economic development they're projecting into the future, all the scenarios show substantial increases in carbon dioxide emissions globally. Even the most conservative projections show substantial increase. So the point being that even if we start taking action now, we're going to be seeing additional warming and additional impacts from climate change as we go forward. And this is sea level rising. And actually that was one of the points that was made about Hurricane Sandy, is that because of the unusual warmth of the Gulf Stream, plus all the melting that's taking place, especially in the Arctic region, has actually caused sea level to rise by several centimeters over the last decade. That's actually been monitored by satellites and ground measurements. So when you have a sea surge coming in from a storm, even like Sandy, the higher water levels, of course, aggravate that. Plus, another thing that I think is also very important is that as populations grow, more and more people are moving to what are currently viewed to be as fragile areas, such as shorelines or mountainous regions where there may be droughts and forest fires. So not only are we experiencing climate change, but our populations are moving to areas that are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And so the impacts and the consequences are much more noticeable to us. So that's my little speech on climate change. And so now I'm going to talk about renewable energy programs. What is it associated with successful renewable energy development? I'll talk about what I've been seeing here over the last 20 years and how that all comes together to allow us to have significant growth in renewable energy technologies around the world. Just before I get into that, I wanted to just put some numbers up here just to kind of set the stage, get a sense of, so I can refer back to these. But the total final energy consumption, this is all energy, not just electricity, globally, is 12,000 million tons of oil equivalent per year. That can be converted to 142,000 terawatt hours per year, or as I showed in that slide earlier, roughly 16 terawatt years per year. That's the current energy consumption globally. This was numbers that came out of the BP Statistical Review. This is an excellent report that comes out. I'm not sure how often, but their most recent one was June 2012. And they go into a pretty detailed analysis of what energy consumption is occurring for all different technologies, renewables as well as fixed or fossil fuels. So of that 16.3 terawatt years per year, roughly 16% of that, or 16.7% of that, is generated by renewable energy. And here we include biomass and hydropower, all hydropower as part of that. And that's actually a pretty large part of total renewables right now. So, And these are numbers that were just recently published in the REN 21 Global Status Report, another excellent document to refer to. And these are reports that are updated every year. And I encourage you to download them from the website and use that as a good reference tool. And then global electricity consumption is about 20,000 terawatt hours per year. And this is coming out of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency fact book, another very important, good source of information. And that's about 14% of total energy consumption. So electricity is still not the dominant way we use energy, but it's growing. Electricity more and more is becoming the preferred choice for energy, for end-use energy consumption. And so the percentage of electricity to the total energy consumption is growing quite significantly. And so the total global electricity generating capacity is a little over 5,000 gigawatts. And again, this is a number coming out of the Global Status Report. And of that, the non-hydro renewables part is about 390 gigawatts. Now, the hydro part is about 1,000 gigawatts. So if you included hydro into the total generating capacity, it's quite substantial. It's almost 25% of the total. That makes renewable energy almost 25% of the total. Without hydro, it's about 6 or 7% of the total. So here are some indicators. Again, these have come from various sources, but just in terms of, and this is trying to lead into the points I'm going to be making here in a moment, but renewable energy investments, new investments, have really grown substantially. Despite the global economic downturn, there's been substantial growth in renewable energy investments from 161 billion US dollars to 257 billion in 2011, and continues to grow at a very substantial rate. I'll talk more about this in a moment, but the solar photovoltaic capacity in gigawatts globally was estimated to be about 70 gigawatts at the end of last year, and I'll show some numbers that project where it's going over the next few years. The capacity for concentrating solar power is still quite low. I'll talk more specifically about why this is growing so much faster than concentrating solar power, but this, other than the trough technologies, some of these technologies are still kind of emerging and have fairly high first costs that are not necessary, and also they have much more stringent constraints on them in terms of resource and land availability. Solar hot water capacity in gigawatt thermal has also grown substantially over the past 3 years. Here's an important point. We'll talk more about this soon, but countries and policy targets. Now, about 118 countries around the world, and maybe even more, have some kind of a government-mandated policy that sets a target for the amount of renewable energy they would like to have in their system. And that's a very substantial growth over the past few years. And so this is really becoming a universally acknowledged technology. Total renewable power capacity in gigawatts, including hydro, has grown quite a bit. Renewables are the fastest growing electricity supply in the world in terms of percentage growth. As I mentioned before, about 1,000 of this is hydro. So what is it that's creating these success stories? Well, I think there's three basic components that are really important. First of all, we're developing technologies that are becoming more and more reliant, they're efficient, they're becoming cost effective. Now, traditionally, renewable energy technologies have higher first costs than traditional energy technologies. But if you look at the long-term cost of energy, the levelized cost of energy, they're competitive now because the fuel source is free to these technologies. But also, because of all the R&D that's being put into these technologies around the world, including right here at Masdar Institute, they're becoming more efficient. The manufacturing costs are coming down. The reliability is such that they'll function for 20 to 30 years now. So that's a very important component to this. But it's not going to be sufficient by itself. I think what's really important also is for governments to produce favorable policies, such as feed-in tariffs or other targets like renewable portfolio standards is a target that you'll hear quite often as well. Other net metering technology or capabilities. These are policies that create an enabling environment for these technologies to be utilized in and therefore create a market that's attractive to investors. And of course, that's the third one, is access to financing. And currently, of that $278 billion or so that you saw is being invested, about 90% of that is coming out of the private sector. So the private sector is really making access to financing more and more available to these technologies because they see these technologies are what we call bankable, that they can invest in these technologies at relatively low risk and get a pretty favorable return on that investment in many cases around the world. So those are the three major components, and I'll go into more detail on these, but I also just wanted to highlight that another very critical factor is getting the communities and society to accept these technologies. And you've probably heard stories about how, for example, in rural villages around the world, maybe the traditional way to gather water was during the daytime was for women to go to a community well and get their water, and it also turns out sometimes to become an important opportunity for social engagement as well. When you introduce, say, a water pump, a solar-powered water pump into a village, that changes the way the community has been used to obtaining water supplies. And sometimes that's not necessarily a favorable impact on the community. So even though the benefits of having a solar-powered water pump are substantial to that community, it does impact the social infrastructure of the community in certain ways. So getting society to accept these technologies, getting the idea of putting solar panels on your roof and not caring about whether it has a visual impact on the roof is a very important step here. And I think this is something that many organizations are focusing on, and you'll see a lot of talk now about community power programs and getting communities to come together and accept these technologies as part of their central power system. So if I put all of this into a flowchart kind of diagram here, this is an old chart I've been using for a number of years, but I'll try to walk through it. But you can see that there's a positive feedback, and this even though this is specific for photovoltaics, I think this applies to many technologies. And we could start almost anywhere on this curve. Let's start here at cost reduction. Okay, the technologies are getting lower and lower cost, and so they're becoming more and more attractive to consumers. And to developers. So the developers come up with innovative business and policies to market these technologies. That creates, and government policies, of course, create expanded markets. So as the costs come down and the business practices improve and the government policies improve, that expands the markets. That attracts private investment because you can make money. And that encourages manufacturers to scale up the product and do more research and development to improve these products. And so there's your positive feedback loop for these technologies. And I think this PV has really fallen into that quite well. And what's the consequence of that? Well, I think I already mentioned these numbers, but by the end of 2011, we had roughly 70 gigawatts globally of solar power. Now that may not look like much compared to the total amount of electricity energy usage we have, but when you consider that 2 years ago it was 27 gigawatts, we're looking at very substantial increases in the deployment of solar PV globally. And there's another way to look at it. This is not a log chart, this is just a linear chart, but you can see this growth, especially starting around 2005 when policies such as feed-in tariffs started kicking in and when technology costs really started coming down. And also when Asian markets started getting put into play, there's a substantial increase. And this only goes out to 2009, and I don't have a more recent version of this chart. Another thing I think is very important is back in the mid-90s, the U.S. was a dominant market, not only for building these panels, but also for consuming these panels. But as the feed-in tariffs in Europe started kicking in, and as manufacturers started setting up manufacturing capacity in Malaysia and the Philippines, and especially China, the U.S. market share has really dropped quite a bit in comparison with other countries. Part of this is not just due to, well, part of it's just due to the fact that over the years, there's been a lot of consolidation in the solar industry. A lot of companies have come and gone. The big companies are getting bigger, and it's really a global enterprise now. So it's really hard to tell who exactly is building a panel in which country anymore explicitly. So this is another reason why that curve drops down so much. And this is coming straight out of the REN 21 report again, just another way of showing the substantial growth, especially, again, like I said, starting around 2005 or 2006, it really takes off over the last few years. And currently, estimates are for another 21 gigawatts to be added in. So we're going to go from 70 to around 91, roughly, by the end of this year. Not quite as much of a growth as we've seen in the past years, but there's a variety of reasons for that. Some countries have decided to curtail feed-in tariffs, and that's slowed down the market. And there's been the cost of it coming down, and partly due to, I think there's an abundant supply now of photovoltaic systems, so that's bringing the cost down. But the markets are somewhat tighter now because feed-in tariffs have been eliminated or curtailed in some critical countries, and we're still suffering the global economic slowdown. But still, we're looking at significant growth. And that, right now, it's estimated to go up to as much as 230 gigawatts by 2017. And this is a report coming out of the IEA and was reported in PV News this past July. And then concentrating solar power is estimated to go up quite a bit. If you recall, I think it was around 2 gigawatts in 2011. There's a lot of projects in the pipeline right now in Spain and the United States, and then in Northern Africa now there's going to be projects, certainly here in the Middle East as well, that are likely to bring the CSP up to about 11 gigawatts in the next 5 years or so. And a very important point on this is on PV, is that we now, this number is about 2 years old, so I'm sure we have many more than 5,000, what we call utility scale systems. These are systems that you take a large piece of land and put large arrays of panels on it. The criteria for utility scale has generally been, how do I get rid of that thing? Well, you can probably see it over there, 1 megawatt. In other words, these are 1 megawatt or larger systems all installed in an array on a piece of land, or perhaps on a rooftop if the roof's big enough. So the important point here is that the growth of utility scale PV has really been driving the market over the last few years. And in my next, after the break, I'm going to be talking more about what that means to utilities and how do they manage that kind of growth. So here's some more indicators, annual PV additions. This is by country, and you can see that Italy had a new feed-in tariff come into play last year, and so they were the largest. That country showed the largest growth in PV of any country in the world. Germany's still very large because of its feed-in tariffs. China is mandating significant markets or installations in the country, especially in Western China. They've already, in the current 5-year plan that's in play, they've already changed their targets 3 times to absorb the very significant growth in manufacturing that's taking place over there. U.S. is 4th because we have pretty stable policies in general, and the states in the United States are very much pushing for solar. So this is primarily driven by the states more so than by the federal government. And then France was number 5 last year. And then here's another way of looking at this, the top 5 countries of annual additions in solar PV. These are the same countries I mentioned before. New capacity investment, China and the US are leading the way there. And in solar water heating, China has by far the biggest market for solar water heating. It's many, many times bigger than any other country, and it continues to grow. For example, I think most buildings there now are mandated to put solar water heating systems on the buildings when they're built. Turkey has a very aggressive policy. Germany, of course, has always had a good policy not only for PV but for solar water heating. India is a big market that's really emerging. And again, Italy, because of its feed-in tariffs, or its policies, not the feed-in tariffs, but its other policies. So back in 2010, the World Energy Outlook, which is published by the International Energy Agency, looked at a number of renewable energy scenarios. This WEO comes out every year. How many of you have heard of the WEO? It's a pretty interesting document that's published. I think the 2012 version just came out a couple of weeks ago. And each year they come out, they focus on a certain technology or concept. So in 2010, they had a big focus on renewable energy scenarios. And these are a little bit hard to read, but they had a variety of, I think, 3 major scenarios. For example, well, they had one they call the 450 scenario, and that was, okay, what is it going to take to make sure that our carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere are capped at 450 parts per million? What kind of a growth scenario in renewable energy would be required to achieve that goal? And then they had some new policy scenarios and then current policy. This is more or less, if we take what's happening right now and project it into the future, that would be this red line. New policies are where some unique policy incentives are coming into play that encourage further growth. So you can see that they project pretty substantial, almost a factor of 5 growth in electricity generation from renewables by 2035 under the 450 scenario. And this is the share of renewable energies in total electricity generation by region under the new policy scenario, which is the blue line here, the middle one. And you can see that there's the European Union would be by far the region that has the most percentage of renewables in the total system. This is what this number is down here. So European Union was projected to have over 25 or 20% renewable energy. United States would be around 12 to 15%. So you can just go down the list. The world is about 10% total. And I know somebody's going to ask me, does that include hydro? And I guess the question is, the answer is I'm not sure. I don't think it does, though. Because if it was hydro, I think these numbers would be much higher. So anyway, this is the kind of projections that IEA came out with. And they've also produced something called a roadmap. And they've got a roadmap for photovoltaics. This was done a couple of years ago. They've recently published one on solar heating and cooling. And I think they have one for concentrating solar power and for wind as well. If not, they're going to be coming out very soon. But again, looking at these same types of projections that I mentioned earlier to achieve certain goals, they see that PV can provide as much as 5% of global electricity generation in the year 2030 and 11% by 2050. So it's a pretty substantial growth, and it's in all sectors. I mean, the residential sector is here, commercial is this area here, utility scale is here, and even the off-grid sector will continue to grow. We often tend to forget about the fact that the off-grid sector has been a major consumer of photovoltaic over the years. So technology research, I'm not sure how much more time I'm going to have in this session, but let me just try to go through this quickly. Again, as part of the technology part of this three-legged stool, I mentioned that's causing the growth in PV. These are the kinds of critical research agendas that are underway now, and not only in the US, but in other countries as well, improving the cell and module performance, looking at new materials that can actually bring down the cost. Some of the materials going to certain technologies are rare earth materials and may be expensive or difficult to come by. And of course, advanced manufacturing techniques. That's a very critical component to bring costs down. Under concentrating solar power, low cost, high performance storage. That's a really big attraction to concentrating solar power, is that because it's using heat to produce electricity, you can store the heat and produce electricity even after the sun sets. And that's a very big selling point to utilities for CSP. Advanced absorbers, reflectors, heat transfer fluids, and next generation of solar concentrators. So those are the major research thrusts in CSP. Going back to PV, I don't think I'll go into too much detail here, but you can see that there's research underway in thin films, amorphous silicon, organic PV, kind of an emerging technology, next generation technologies. These numbers here represent the current or projected efficiency of these technologies. I think thin film is going up quite a bit, though. This is a fairly old slide. Crystalline silicon, of course, the workhorse of the industry, is expected to continue to improve in efficiency and manufacturing capability. SIGs, what's it, cadmium, indium, gallium selenide, thank you, is another popular thin film technology. Very good. Dye sensitized cells, these are the kind of cells that go on, you can put on clothing or on backpacks and charge up batteries out in the field. And building integrated PV is a major thrust of research. And these efficiency numbers, I think, are pretty low. This, like I said, this slide is several years old. And this is also pretty old, but these are the current market sector cost per energy in US dollars in residential, commercial, and utility. Under the current market, ranging from 5 to 16 cents for residential, 5 to 15 cents for commercial, and 4 to 7 cents for utility. But like I said, this is an old slide from back in the mid-2000s, and the targets going out to 2015, I think we're actually exceeding these now, partly because of the large, almost, I hate to use the word glut, but that's what it is, of PV that's on the market right now. This is another way of indicating how the technology research has been beneficial. Somebody at NREL put together all the cell efficiency research reports they could find to show how, starting back in 1975, how the efficiency of a cell, which goes into a module, has improved based on all the different research efforts that are underway. So this is the result of primarily government-supported, but even industry-supported R&D that shows a general improvement in cell efficiency, which of course brings down price and improves their cost effectiveness. This is something called a learning curve. Do you know what learning curves are? Basically, this is, you take the module price and the cumulative production and plot it up on a log-log chart. And we find in many technologies, it tends to fall on more or less a straight line on a log-log chart. And basically, if you look at the slope of this line, it tells you that there's been roughly a 20% learning curve on photovoltaics, and this is for crystalline silicon technologies, since 1975. And I know that there's some more recent ones that continue to stay more or less on this line. There's been a few deviations. This is back when the cost of silicon suddenly jumped way up and became hard to come by, and I'm not sure what happened here. But at any rate, so that what this is saying is that roughly module prices decrease by 20% for every doubling of cumulative capacity. So again, this is a scaling up, this shows how scaling up these technologies brings down their costs. The US has a $1 a watt goal. I don't know how many of you have heard of that, to try to bring module prices down to $1 a watt. Actually, I think the glut of PV on the market now has already achieved that in some cases, but I don't know how sustainable that is. But basically, the US research program focuses around how do you get the cost of a module, which in 2010 was roughly $3.40 per watt for a full system, of balance of systems down to $1 a watt. And they looked at the three major parts. The power electronics is all the electronical gear you have to get power out of the cells and the modules into the grid. This is the balance of systems, which includes all the mounting hardware and everything. This is a module itself. And you can see that the module is roughly half of the cost of a total system. So if you're trying to reduce costs in utility scale photovoltaic systems, the module is only half of the issue. It's these other balance of systems that also have to be addressed in research programs. But the expectation is that and when this program initially started, which is called the Sunshot program, it started a couple of years ago by the U.S. Department of Energy. The goal was $1 a watt by 2020, I think, or 2022, something like that. And like I say, in certain market right now, I think we may already be there, at least temporarily. So again, research is all about bringing down costs. So for example, this is the chain for polysilicon or amorphous silicon, or excuse me, crystalline silicon modules. Of course, you first start with your feedstock, and then you produce wafers, which then are made into cells, which are then made into modules. And so I just wanted to put this up because this shows how there's a lot of information on the slide, so I won't go into any kind of a detail, but this just shows again how research programs, especially like the U.S. Department of Energy's research program, focus on each of these parts of the value of the manufacturing chain to try to bring down the costs. And again, this is all driving the research efforts in the United States. So that's the technology part of the three-legged stool. The investment flows, I've already talked about this, so I won't go into much detail, but you can see from the global status report that globally, investments in renewable energy technologies have grown from 39 billion US dollars to roughly 257 billion this last year. It continues to go up. Here's where the global economic crisis hit, and it actually did slow down investment to some extent, but it's picked right back up again, and it's projected to continue. And you can see some numbers here. It's 6 times the level of investment now than was in 2004. There's some parts of this number that are hard to get our hands on. Like, for example, there's a lot of solar water heating systems, and that doesn't always get captured in these numbers very effectively. And there's also large hydro that's included. That's not included. This does not include large hydro. If you add that in, the number jumps up to $282 billion. So basically, the rate of growth has slowed somewhat, but it was 37%, even after the global recession. And again, this is out of the WEO report that I mentioned earlier. These are just projections of investment for different countries. You can see European Union and China, the United States, and India still expect to have significant investment. This diamond-shaped dot here is a share of total generation investment. In other words, this is the renewable energy share of total energy investment, I think. Yeah. Okay. And here's cumulative investments. And again, the United States, European Union, and China are really the leaders in investment in these technologies. And then the third thing is the policy landscape. And I'll just show this quickly. These are this is again out of the Global Status Report, and it shows the countries that have policies of some kind or another. 9 new countries came in with targets or policies in between the 2012 and the 2011 report. And more than half of these are from developing countries. There have been some setbacks from a lack of long-term policy, certainty and stability in many countries, and that's the one thing that's going to hurt the industry is risk is uncertainty. The industry has a hard time making substantial investments in these technologies for future growth with uncertainty in government policies. And for example, in the United States, there's a production tax credit that has not yet been renewed. And that fact that it is not being renewed has caused some wind companies to actually curtail plans for developing projects in the United States. And that in turn has hurt companies like Vestas, who have major manufacturing facilities in the United States, including one right close to where I live in Colorado. And they've actually been laying people off lately because this production tax credit has not yet been renewed by the US Congress. So these types of political uncertainties have a negative impact on the growth of these technologies. And so that's policy landscape is extremely important. So this maybe I better move on faster here. I just wanted to mention quickly that there are a number of renewable energy roadmaps that have been done. I can just click through these real quickly. These are reports that have tried to figure out how can the world come up to a very, very substantial amount of renewable energy, or even 100% renewable energy, or how can the world cap carbon dioxide concentrations at 450 parts per million, which is very challenging right now because we're already approaching 400 parts per million, and there's not much let up in emissions, in carbon emissions. So, but these roadmaps, and I'll just put this list out here to let you get an idea. There's EASA just recently published the Global Energy Assessment. It's a very, very comprehensive report. I encourage you to go check it out. It's got a lot of good technical information in there. I don't know if you've heard of EASA. It's an organization in Vienna, Austria, that does a lot of analytical work in renewable energy. The IEA's World Energy Outlooks has been addressing these, especially the one in 2010. They also have another series of reports called Global Energy Perspectives that looks at scenarios to getting up to high penetrations. I'm not too familiar with this report. Maybe some of you may know more about it. Greenpeace has published reports not only for the world, but they go into specific countries and do scenario analysis for individual countries as well. Of course, the IPCC came up with some projections, and those you can find in the special report on renewable energy. World Energy Council, World Wild Fund just recently came out with a 100% renewable energy report, and so on. And there's many elements that are involved in these that we've already talked about here: technology maturity, R&D breakthroughs, government policy, investment, access to low-cost capital, resource availability, of course, my favorite, public acceptance, utility acceptance. We'll talk about that next time. And supportive infrastructure, global trade relations, of course, etc. And then there's other things that are also important that don't always get talked about in some of these reports. Gender empowerment, especially in rural developing areas. Local and community action, very important. Good urban planning, building design, transportation planning, land use planning, consumption patterns, material use, energy efficiency. All of these come together to create a good investment environment. And then I think I just want to close quickly here. Again, this is something taken out of the Global Status Report, but we cannot forget about the 1.3 billion people currently who have no access to reliable electricity at all. And they're going to need if we're going to have 100% energy access for all, which is the goal of the United Nations now as well, we have to address that part of the world that's currently does not have that access to electricity. And I think we have to do it in a clean energy framework. 2.6 billion people still rely on traditional biomass for heating and cooling. So, as I said, the Ban Ki-moon came up with the energy access, sustainable energy for all goal to provide 100% access to modern energy services by 2030. Lower prices of renewable energy technologies are allowing manufacturers to diversify the markets, so that's the good thing. And financial models in rural energy are now available. So there's been some real success stories about getting large amounts of photovoltaic systems, for example, solar home systems into rural communities because of various financing mechanisms that have been put into place by private sector and public-private partnerships. So. Right now I'm going to talk about more specific information on deploying photovoltaics especially, and this gets into the kind of research that I was doing at NREL, so I'm somewhat more comfortable with answering questions in this than I was in some of the other information on trends. But I'm going to talk about deployment in general and then the challenge of grid integration, because for the future of solar, we have to figure out how to get this technology integrated into the grid effectively so that utility operators have confidence in these large-scale penetrations of solar or even wind variable technologies. And then I'll close with my statement about ISIS. So the opportunity, solar versus oil. Solar, as we showed before, it's an abundant supply of a resource available to us, but it's a diffuse resource. It varies over time and at the ground level, of course, because of weather conditions. It varies spatially. It varies temporally. Obviously, we only have it half the time, half the day. Whereas oil it's a consistent source. You can, you know where it is and you know how to get it out of the ground and how to use it as a source of energy. But oil is non-renewable and solar is renewable. But these are significant differences in as a fuel source that have to be addressed when you start utilizing solar. But again, this is just going to show how solar and oil compare as an energy source. 13 parking spaces is equivalent to 1 barrel of oil in terms of producing 1.7 megawatts of energy per day. In other words, the sun falling on more or less. This is primary energy, right? This would be for electricity. Yeah, primary energy, right, yes. Just another way of scaling this. All right, so in the project development process, generally you can break it down into 4 categories. There's other ways to do this, but since I'm going to be talking about the solar resource and the measurement of that solar resource, this is probably one way to look at it. There's a preliminary concept and what we call pre-feasibility analysis stage of a project. And then you get into the feasibility study. This is where you start thinking that you're going to have a bankable project and you start putting together all the engineering details of the project. And then you have due diligence, which is an independent evaluation of the project and to confirm whether or not it's going to get its financing. And then operations, once the project's in the ground. And these are so policy decisions, initial technology and site selection, investor commitments, engineering design, and system integration. And these steps require an increasing spatial and temporal resolution of solar resource information. And this is going to be the basis of what I'll talk about, is how that solar resource information is being used to help better understand how to deploy large amounts of especially photovoltaic systems into the grid. Okay, next. So from the solar resource, have you all had any experience measuring the solar resource, or you understand, does everybody know what direct normal irradiation? Okay, good. You're a smart group here. So certain technologies, like concentrating technologies, rely on just what's coming directly out of the sun. Other technologies, such as flat plate collectors, which are photovoltaics and solar water heating systems, can use energy not only from the sun itself, but they can actually get some energy out of the sky, the clouds reflecting off the sun and the haze in the sky. That's why concentrating solar technologies are very site-specific in terms of where they can be utilized effectively. So when we measure the solar resource, we have essentially the same issues as well, where we need to understand what's the total resource coming from the sun and the sky on a global horizontal surface. That's the fundamental way we measure the solar resource for global horizontal insolation, is what it's called. And that information is being used by the flat plate collector technologies. And then the direct normal resources, we have to come up with ways of designing instruments that will follow the sun as it passes over the sky, and to measure the direct normal insolation. Those instruments are called pyrheliometers. So the next slide, I think, shows examples of, these are global horizontal measuring devices. This is a tracker that's measuring the direct sun coming, or the direct insolation coming from the sun. And then we have some instruments that can measure, that can give us both components by, this is called a rotating shadow band radiometer. Here's your sensor, it's pointing at the sun, but occasionally this band will shade that sensor, so it's measuring only the sky radiation and it blocks out the sun. And then you can use a simple equation to calculate the direct normal and the global horizontal from that instrument. These are more traditional instruments that shade the sun. It's a fixed ring sitting around it, so it's only measuring the diffuse. This one has some holes in it, so occasionally it's measuring the sun as well as the diffuse, but this is a more traditional type of measurement for that. So I just wanted to put a quick primer on resource measurements up here, just to give you a sense of when we talk about concentrating solar power and photovoltaic systems, getting a good measurement of the resource available to those technologies is very critical. And especially when you go back to the financial community to ask for money for your project, they're going to want to know how well do you understand what the resource is and what its characteristics are like, because that could potentially be a big element of risk for them. In lieu of measurements, I mean, measurement systems are quite expensive, and they aren't all over everywhere available to us. So over the years, the research community has come up with a way of using satellite imagery from weather satellites to estimate the solar resource at the ground level. And generally we use weather satellites that are called geostationary weather satellites. These are satellites that are sitting right over the equator at a fixed location. They orbit the Earth at the same speed that the Earth is rotating. So they're always sitting at the same location. And for example, the US has two satellites called GOES West and GOES East. The Europeans have a couple of satellites, Meteosat. This satellite I don't think exists any longer. It's a Chinese satellite, although they do have some new ones up. There are actually two Meteosats, one sitting over the equator and right at 0 degrees longitude, and another one sitting over here, roughly. And then there's a Japanese satellite, GMS, sitting over here. So this circle represents the field of view that the satellite is able to see. And by monitoring the amount of reflecting in the visible channel coming off of the Earth's surface, we can use that information, and I'll go and show the example here in a few minutes, to calculate, to calculate the solar resource. And then other weather satellites are what we call polar orbiters. These satellites go over the poles. These are much lower latitude, or lower elevation rather, so they're circling the Earth every 90 minutes or so, but they're much closer to the Earth's surface, so they can get even much more detailed information. However, these satellites are not used too much by the solar resource community for solar resource assessment. The primary tool that we're using right now are these geostationary satellites. Okay. So here's just a quick way of how we calculate solar resource from these satellite data. Next slide, please, or next one. It's two parts. First of all, you start off with to determine what's the clear sky background. In other words, what is the amount of reflectance coming off of the Earth's surface when you have no clouds at all, and then you next slide, please, and then you start looking at what's the reflectance when there may be a cloud there, and then that gives you the combination of this information and this information gives you the total resource estimate. So the next slide shows how we do that. The satellite is measuring the amount of reflectance coming off of the Earth's surface in terms of brightness in the visible channel. And it's actually in terms of roughly 256 categories of brightness. So if and it turns out that the brighter the reflectance means the more clouds there are, because the Earth's surface is typically much darker than clouds are. And so if we know, this is at the very lowest reflectance levels, so we can pretty safely assume that this is where we have our clear skies. And then you get all these conditions, reflectance conditions based on the amount of clouds that are available. And so next slide shows that we call this a dynamic range between a clear condition. This is for a given pixel or a given point on Earth. We have the clearest condition, and then we have various levels of conditions that are caused by clouds, especially if you know what the haze is. The haze is something you try to factor in beforehand. When you change satellites, you have to start this all over again, because the different satellites have different dynamic ranges built into their sensors. And you can see that there's a slight decay over time as time goes on. So this is, for example, the GOES, one of the US satellites. Next slide then. Okay, so based on that information of the dynamic range gives us an opportunity to come up with what we call a cloud index, which is a way we calculate or estimate solar resources at the Earth's surface. And we can do that at a very high spatial resolution. Here's a map of a 10-kilometer resolution solar resource in the direct normal installation that was generated for the southwestern United States. And there are some methods out there now that can get it down to 1 kilometer resolution. The actual limits of the satellite itself is about 1 kilometer in the visible range, so it's possible to get even much more detailed information than this. But here's an example of a solar map for direct normal installation from the southwestern United States, where most of our concentrating solar power is going to occur. Now, the real advantage of coming up with solar resource information using this methodology is that you have nice gridded values that are gridded based on latitude and longitude coordinates. And so it makes this information, this data set, very amenable to putting it into geographic information systems. And then somebody was asking a question earlier about the fact that when I showed that sun, that the potential was very, very large, and it probably isn't very realistic. And that's true. That's sort of like the theoretical potential of the solar resource when you calculate it the way I showed in the previous talk. When you can get the information into a more detailed format like this, you can start applying your GIS tools. And the next slide shows that if you start masking out land areas that have too much terrain for concentrating solar power, because you really need pretty flat places for those technologies, or if you mask out parks in areas that you could never develop, or if you try to eliminate areas that are too far from transmission lines and you know it would cost too much to run a transmission from the system to the transmission line, then you can actually come up with a more detailed view of where the solar resource is that you can actually utilize and how much that is. And you can see here, for example, that when we start masking out all these constraints, the concentrating solar power resource in the southwest United States is quite a few less areas available than you would have thought from looking at the previous map. And so that information then allows you to go to calculate the next slide, the actual potential of concentrating solar power based on your assumptions and how you exclude land. And so this is just an example that was done for the southwestern United States, and they came up with a calculation of 26 million gigawatt hours per year potential solar generating capacity just in those areas where you see the colored dots, where you put concentrating solar power in there. So even when you mask out all of this land and you reduce the amount of potential development into much more finite areas, you can still see that the potential far exceeds even what the national current electricity demand is in the United States right now. So you could argue that, especially if you have the proper technology and storage and everything, you could power all of the United States electricity needs from concentrating solar power in the western United States. Now let me talk about the real challenges associated with putting these technologies into the grid. Anybody have any questions about those slides? Have any of you worked on geographic information systems here? Some of you have, yeah. Really powerful tool for renewable energy applications. Do they teach GIS here at the Institute? You know, I tried to learn it. It's challenging. It's challenging software, but it's really fascinating what you can do with it. Okay, so the meteorological and utility challenge is variable renewable energy. That's the key term to recognize. When you have oil resources or coal resources, you can basically run a plant constantly without any variability, as long as there's no mechanical problems. But with solar and with wind, you cannot do that. It's just impossible. The solar and the wind are going to vary because the weather varies. So you're now talking to a utility operator about putting a lot of variable resources into their system. Next slide, please. And so this is why they get gray hair quickly, because they have this vision of this is a solar plant in Florida, and you can see these shadows. I think it shows up better here. You can see these shadows of clouds passing over the solar plant. And that's going to happen all day long, and it's going to happen different ways during different times of the day. This is only a 25 megawatt system, but if you start putting many of these all over Florida, you're starting to talk about something that the utility operators are going to begin to see in their quality of power that's coming out of the system. So that's a very important concept for utilities to be thinking about. And the future of solar is going to depend on our utility operators coming to grips with this phenomenon and being able to incorporate these technologies into the system successfully. And some utilities are going to be able to do that better than others. The IEA came up with a report a couple of years ago, Harnessing Variable Renewables. And for those of you who are interested in grid integration issues, this is a very important report to get. And there are a variety of ways that a utility handles